My wife cheated on me in a bar with my best friend and just apologized. I used to think a bar was the safest place to lose track of time, loud enough to drown out worries, bright enough to hide small disappointments, familiar enough to feel like home. That was the lie I told myself every Friday, because it was easier than admitting I liked routines, and routines made me feel in control, and control was what I clung to after years of building a life that looked solid from the outside. I walked into Harbor Street Bar that night with my wife beside me, her hand on my arm like a casual claim, warm fingers through my sleeve, and our friends already inside waving at us like we were late to our own party. The kind of party where nothing ever truly happened, the kind where the biggest surprise was a new beer on tap. I remember the exact moment my stomach tightened, not because I saw anything wrong, but because everything looked too right, too arranged, like someone had rehearsed it. My best friend Nate was at the center of the table, laughing a little too hard, leaning back like he owned the air, and my wife laughed with him in a way that carried farther than the music, a bright sound that made strangers glance over. She had always been friendly. That was her gift. She made rooms softer. She made people feel chosen, and I used to be proud of that, until I realized that same gift could be a knife if she turned it the wrong way. Nate slapped my shoulder when I reached the table, the old brother move. The one that says we are still us, he said. You made it, finally. And I joked that he was only there for the wings. Everyone laughed, even my wife. And I told myself the tightness in my stomach was just hunger. I ordered the first round, because that was my habit too, to pay first, to keep things smooth, to be the reliable one. It sounds ridiculous now, but in that moment I felt like a man doing his job well. Husband, friend, anchor. The music hummed, glasses clinked. The bartender slid napkins under wet rings, and the night unfolded the same way every other night had, until small details started to drift out of place, like magnets losing their pull. It began with a text, a tiny buzz against my thigh. I checked it under the table, thinking work, because work never slept, but it was from an unknown number, no name, no picture, just words that made my mouth go dry. It said, "Do not look at your wife right now. Watch your friend." I stared at the screen, reread it, then looked up anyway, because that is what people do when they are told not to. I saw my wife smiling at the girl beside her. I saw Nate leaning forward, elbow on the table, talking like he was telling a secret. Nothing obvious, nothing you could accuse, but the message did something to me. It changed the angle of everything, like turning a picture frame just slightly until you notice the crack in the glass. I slid my phone into my pocket and forced myself to breathe. I told myself it was a prank, or a wrong number, or some drunk stranger trying to stir trouble. I even smiled, because that is my skill, to smile through uncertainty. But my eyes started tracking details I had never tracked before. My wife touching her hair, and then resting her fingers on the table closer to Nate than to me. Nate keeping his body angled toward her even while he talked to others. Nate offering to refill her drink before anyone asked. Little acts that could be harmless, little acts that could be rehearsed. And every time my wife laughed, I noticed it matched Nate's rhythm, like they shared the same invisible metronome. Our friends were all there, the usual crew, Jenna and her boyfriend Mason, who argued about sports and made up 5 minutes later. Chris, who told the same story every week and still got laughs because he told it like it mattered. And Leah, who watched people like she was reading them. I caught Leah's eyes once, just once, and she looked away too fast. That small movement hit me harder than any message, because Leah never looked away, not from anyone, not from anything. She was the kind of person who could call out a lie before it was finished, and now she looked like she was protecting something or protecting someone. I asked my wife if she wanted to play darts like we always did, and she said in a minute, just finishing this conversation, and she did not look at me when she said it. She looked at Nate, and Nate nodded like he approved, and my throat tightened again. I stood up anyway, pretending I needed the restroom, pretending everything was normal, and I walked toward the back hall where the lights were dimmer and the music sounded far away. I did not go into the restroom. I paused near the corner where you could see the hallway to the patio door, a short corridor with a neon beer sign buzzing like a trapped insect. I waited, telling myself I was being paranoid, telling myself I was not that guy, the guy who spies, the guy who ruins a good night with suspicion. And then I saw my wife stand up, her purse staying on the chair, her phone in her hand. She said something to Jenna. Jenna nodded, and my wife walked away from the table, straight toward the back hall, not toward the restroom, not toward the bar, but toward the patio corridor. And after a beat, Nate stood up too, casual, like he was just stretching his legs, like he was just grabbing fresh air, and he followed her at the exact distance that makes it look like coincidence. My hands went cold. I stepped back into the shadow, and I watched them without moving. My wife reached the patio door and pushed it open. A gust of winter air slipped in, carrying a smell of smoke and wet pavement. She slipped outside. Nate followed. The door swung shut, and for a moment all I saw was the buzzing neon reflection in the glass. Then the door cracked again because someone outside laughed, and through that narrow opening I saw my wife's face tilt up, saw her smile in a way she never smiled at me anymore. Not lately. Not when we were tired. Not when we were busy. I saw Nate's hand touch her elbow, too familiar. And she did not pull away. I should have stormed. Outside. I should have confronted them. I should have demanded answers right then. But my body did something strange. It froze, not from fear, but from disbelief, like my brain needed time to accept a new reality. I leaned against the wall and tried to make sense of it. Maybe Nate was giving her advice. Maybe she was upset and needed air. Maybe they were planning a surprise for me. That thought almost made me laugh. Because what kind of surprise looks like secrecy? What kind of gift requires? Hiding behind a patio door, my phone buzzed again. Same unknown number, another message. It said you are being played. This is not the first time. I stared at it so long my eyes started to burn. My fingers hovered over the screen, ready to reply, "Who are you?" Ready to ask, "What do you want?" But something stopped me, because whoever was texting me knew too much. And that meant this was bigger than one bad moment. Bigger than one drunk mistake. It meant there was a story unfolding that I had not been invited into. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and walked toward the bar as if I was going to order another round. Because I needed to see the table. I needed to see who knew. I needed to see who was acting. And when I reached the table, Jenna's smile looked too fixed. Mason was talking, but his eyes flicked toward the patio door every few seconds. Chris was laughing, but it sounded forced, like he was filling space. Leah stared down at her drink like it was suddenly fascinating. And the empty chairs where my wife and Nate had been felt like a spotlight, a loud absence. I sat down slowly, and I realized the scariest part was not what might be happening outside. The scariest part was that everyone inside seemed to be waiting for something. Like they were waiting for me to notice. I lifted my glass and took a sip, and the beer tasted like metal. My heart thumped in my ears, and I forced myself to speak casually. I said, "Where did they go?" "Just air," Jenna said too quickly, and Mason nodded like a puppet, and Leah's fingers tightened around her glass. I smiled and nodded back, acting like I believed them, acting like I was still the easy husband, the easy friend, but inside something hardened, a quiet decision forming. Because if they wanted me calm, then calm is exactly what I would be. I would not give them a scene. I would not give them the satisfaction of chaos. I would give them patience, and patience can be cruel. I stood up again and said, "I'm going to grab some napkins," and I walked toward the bar. But instead of napkins, I asked the bartender, a guy named Ron who had seen our group 100 times. I asked him, keeping my voice light, "Hey, you got cameras on the patio door area?" Ron glanced at me. His smile faded just a little, and he said, "Yeah." "Why?" And that tiny pause told me he already knew the answer. My phone buzzed a third time, and when I looked, the message was longer. It said, "You have 10 minutes before they come back. Do not confront. Watch what they do when they think you do not know." And at the bottom of the message was a single word that made my skin prickle. It said, "Check the booth." I stared at the word booth, and my eyes drifted across the room to the back corner where the old leather booth sat under a broken lamp. The booth we used to claim when the place was crowded. The booth with the wall behind it covered in framed photos. The booth where Nate and I had planned vacations and talked about our futures. I watched it now, and I noticed something I had not noticed earlier. A small black object tucked under the edge of the table, barely visible, like it had been placed there carefully. I set my glass down, and my legs started moving before my mind fully caught up. I walked toward that booth, each step loud in my head, the music fading into a dull roar, and the closer I got, the more certain I became that whatever was under that table was not an accident, and whatever was happening outside was only the surface of something deeper, something planned. And I reached the booth, bent slightly, and saw the object clearly, a phone, not mine, face down, as if it had been dropped in a hurry. And when I flipped it over, the screen lit up with a familiar lock screen photo, Nate's dog, Nate's phone, and on that screen, a notification popped up while I held it, a message from my wife. One sentence, no emojis, no softness, just cold and confident. It said, "Meet me by the car after. He suspects nothing." And my hand tightened so hard my knuckles ached. Because in that moment the hook sank deep. Not just betrayal, but coordination. Not just a mistake, but a pattern. And I realized the unknown number was not trying to save me out of kindness. They were trying to steer me, and I had no idea why, or who they were. Only that the night I thought I knew everyone had just become a test, and I was standing in the middle of it holding the evidence like a live wire. I slid Nate's phone back under the booth table exactly where I found it, because taking it would change the game too fast. And right then, speed was my enemy. I needed time. Time to watch. Time to understand who was moving pieces. My pulse slowed as if my body accepted a new rule. Stay quiet. Stay observant. Stay invisible. I returned to the table with a stack of napkins I did not need. And the moment I sat down, Jenna asked if I was okay. Her voice too careful, like she was testing thin ice. I smiled and said, "Yeah, just needed air." And that lie tasted cleaner than the truth would have. Through the glass, I saw the patio door open and close. My wife stepped back. Inside first, cheeks red from the cold, eyes bright like she had just heard good news. Nate followed a moment later, adjusting his jacket, scanning the room before he locked eyes with me. That fraction of a second told me everything. He was checking damage, checking whether the world had shifted while he was gone. I raised my glass to him, a casual salute, and he relaxed instantly, smiling back. The smile of a man who believed his cover was still intact. They sat down like nothing happened. My wife leaned close to me and said, "It's freezing out there," and I nodded, placing my hand over hers, feeling how steady it was. No tremor, no hesitation, and that steadiness scared me more than panic ever could, because panic would mean regret, and this felt rehearsed. Nate launched into a story about some guy he met at work, loud enough to reclaim the table's attention, and everyone laughed at the right beats, like they were all reading from the same invisible script. I checked the time, 9:43. The message said 10 minutes, and my mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the unknown number wanted me to see them leave together. Maybe they wanted me to lose control. Maybe they wanted proof. I glanced toward the booth again. The phone still there, untouched, a quiet promise waiting. Leah caught my eye, and this time she did not look away. Her expression was tight, apologetic, and that was when I knew she knew everything, or at least enough to feel guilty. I raised an eyebrow just slightly, a question without words, and she shook her head almost imperceptibly. Not now? My wife excused herself to the restroom, phone in hand, and Nate followed a few minutes later saying he needed to make a call. The table barely reacted, as if this pattern was familiar, as if no one questioned it anymore. I stood too, saying I was going to settle the tab early, because old habits die hard, and Ron looked at me like he wanted to say something but did not know how. I paid, thanked him, and asked casually if he saw my wife head out back again. Ron hesitated, then said she went toward the parking lot, and that was enough. I stepped outside, the cold air biting through my jacket, the parking lot slick with melted snow, cars idling, engines humming, breath visible in clouds. I stayed near the wall, hidden by shadow, and watched. My wife stood by my car, arms crossed, rocking slightly on her heels. Nate appeared from between two trucks, phone pressed to his ear, then lowered it when he reached her. They stood close, not touching, but close enough that the space between them felt intimate. Dangerous. She said something I could not hear. He laughed softly, shaking his head, and then he leaned in. I did not rush forward. I did not shout. I stayed exactly where I was, because I needed to see how far it went when they thought the world was asleep. Nate said something, and my wife nodded. Then she stepped back, looking toward the bar entrance, checking if anyone was watching, and that was when she saw me. Or rather, she saw the shape of me, a shadow where I should not have been. Her eyes widened just a little, not enough for panic, enough for calculation. Nate followed her gaze, and for a heartbeat the three of us were frozen in a triangle of understanding. Then my phone buzzed again. Unknown number, another message. It said, "Now you see it. But this is not the end. Watch what he does next." And before I could react, Nate turned away from my wife, walking fast toward his car, his posture stiff, defensive, like a man already preparing excuses. My wife walked back toward the bar entrance, head high, composed, and I stepped back into the shadow, letting her pass without seeing me clearly, because I wanted her to believe I was still inside, still clueless. Inside the bar, the noise swallowed everything. My wife returned to the table smiling, telling a story about the restroom line, and everyone nodded, accepting it. Nate did not come back. A text buzzed on my wife's phone. She glanced at it and her smile flickered, just for a second, then she excused herself again, saying she had a headache and wanted to go home early. She kissed my cheek, the same kiss she always used when she was ending something, and said, "Are you coming?" And I said, "In a minute. Finishing up here." She left, and the table went quiet, the kind of quiet that screams. Leah finally spoke, her voice low. She said I tried to tell her to stop, and that was the moment everything shifted from suspicion to confirmation. Jenna stared into her drink. Mason looked at the door like he wanted to escape. Chris asked what was going on, confused and late as always, and I stood up, thanked them all for coming out, and walked back to the booth one last time. I reached under the table and picked up Nate's phone, no hesitation now, and as I did, another message appeared on my own phone, the unknown number again. It said, "You have his phone now. Good. Do not unlock it yet. Meet me tomorrow." And for the first time, there was a location attached, a diner on the edge of town we never went to anymore, because it reminded us of old times. And I realized this story was no longer about catching them. It was about understanding why someone else cared enough to guide me through it. I slipped Nate's phone into my pocket, walked out into the cold night alone, and for the first time since the evening began, I did not feel confused or angry. I felt focused, because whatever was waiting for me tomorrow had been building longer than this night, longer than this bar, longer than my marriage, and I was finally being invited to see it. I did not go home that night, Not right away. I drove past my own street and kept going until the city lights thinned and the radio turned to static. Because I needed distance from familiar walls, I parked near the river and sat there with the engine off, Nate's phone heavy in my pocket like borrowed guilt, my own phone lighting up again and again with messages from my wife asking where I was, each one calmer than the last, each one designed to pull me back into routine. I did not answer. Instead, I watched the water move under the bridge, slow and patient. And I realized patience was becoming my weapon. Morning came without sleep, just a long blur of thoughts and cold air. I showered at a gym, changed clothes, and drove toward the diner from the message, a low building with faded red seats and a sign that flickered like it was unsure about existing. The kind of place people choose when they do not want to be seen. I parked 2 spaces away from a gray sedan, and before I could step out, my phone buzzed. Unknown number again. It said sit first. Watch who comes in. So I did. Through the window, I saw a woman step inside. Mid-30s maybe. Dark coat. Hair tied back. Eyes scanning the room like she expected trouble. She chose a booth with her back to the wall, ordered coffee, and waited. I knew without knowing that she was the one. When I entered, she looked up once, nodded slightly, and went back to her cup. I slid into the opposite side. Keeping space between us, she said my name quietly, not asking, and that was the moment my spine went stiff, because I had never told the unknown number my name. She said my name again, and then said, I am not here to ruin your life. That part is already done. I am here because Nate and your wife ruined mine first. The words landed slow, controlled. She did not sound angry. She sounded finished. She told me she was Nate's ex-girlfriend, not recent, years ago, before my marriage, before everything looked settled. She said Nate cheated on her with someone from their friend group too. Someone. Everyone protected. Someone who smiled at parties. She said when she found out they told her she was imagining things, that she was jealous, dramatic, unstable, until she walked away and rebuilt herself somewhere quieter. She said last month she recognized my wife in a photo online, tagged at a bar, Harbor Street, and something clicked. Patterns repeat when no one stops them. She started watching. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just timing, social posts, gaps, and soon enough she knew. She said she tried to warn me anonymously because men like Nate only understand exposure, not confrontation. I asked her why not just tell me directly, and she said because if I walked into this blind with anger you would lose. Calm men survive longer. I asked what she wanted now, and she looked at Nate's phone in my hand, still unlit, and said I want you to see who he really is, not the version he shows at bars. She told me the phone held messages that would explain everything, not just with my wife but with others, plans, jokes, lies, and names I would recognize. She said unlock it and read. But not here, not yet. She slid a folded paper across the table, an address, and said tonight, bring the phone. Do not tell anyone, not even her. I asked if she wanted revenge, and she shook her head, saying revenge burns fast, truth burns slow, and slow burns last. Then she stood up, paid for her coffee, and left without another word, leaving me with a cooling cup and a choice that felt heavier than anger. I sat there a long time, watching the door, listening to the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, and finally I unlocked Nate's phone. The screen opened to a flood of messages, not just one thread, dozens, names I knew and names I did not, jokes about trust, schedules, signals, code words for being alone, my wife's name appearing more than once, not loving, not emotional, practical, efficient. My chest tightened, but I kept reading, because stopping would give the pain control, and I was done giving control away. I locked the phone again, stood up, and walked out into daylight that felt too bright for secrets. On the drive home, my wife finally called, her voice sweet, worried, asking if we could talk, saying she hated how the night ended. I told her we would talk tonight, calmly, honestly, and she agreed too quickly, relief in her tone, and that told me she still believed she was ahead. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was there, engine warm, meaning she had just arrived too. Timing like that used to feel comforting. Now it felt staged. I walked inside and she was in the kitchen, making coffee like nothing was wrong. She smiled and said, you look tired. I said we both are, and I realized the confrontation was coming whether I rushed it or not. But the woman from the diner was right. Truth burns slow, and tonight was only the first spark, because the address in my pocket promised something bigger, something that would decide how this story ended. We sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee cooling between us, the house quiet in a way it had not been for months. My wife talked first, filling the silence with small worries about work and friends and how last night felt off. She never mentioned Nate by name, and that omission told me more than any confession could. I listened, nodding at the right moments, watching how easily she performed normal, how practiced her tone was. When she finally asked what was wrong, I said I knew about the bar. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I just watched her eyes change, a flicker of fear quickly buried under control. She said you misunderstood, then said nothing happened, then said even if something did not mean anything. Each line delivered like steps she had rehearsed. I let her talk until she ran out of words. Then I placed Nate's phone on the table between us, face down. The room seemed to shrink around that object. Her breath caught. Just once, and I knew the truth had landed. She did not reach for the phone. She did not deny it was his. She just stared at the wood grain like it might save her. I told her we would not finish this conversation now. Not because I was weak, but because I wanted it clean. I said tonight we would both be at the address I named. Her head snapped up, eyes sharp, asking how I knew about that place. And that question sealed everything. Because I had not told her what the address was, she realized her mistake too late, her face going pale. And for the first time, she looked like someone who had lost control of the story. I stood up, picked up the phone, and said, "Pack whatever you need. Tonight decides what comes next." She asked who else would be there. And I said everyone who should have told the truth a long time ago. When I walked out the door, I felt strangely steady, because the slow burn had finally reached the edge, and there was no turning back now. The address led us to a rented hall on the edge of town, the kind used for meetings no one advertises. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, folding chairs set in a loose circle like a quiet judgment. Cars already parked outside told me we were not first. I stepped in with Nate's phone in my pocket and felt the weight of eyes turned toward us. My wife slowed beside me, her confidence gone, replaced by calculation, scanning faces, counting exits. Leo was there, standing near the wall, arms folded. Jenna beside her looking sick with guilt. Mason staring at the floor. Even Ron from the bar leaned against a table pretending he did not belong. And then Nate walked in last, stopping short when he saw me. His expression shifting from surprise to irritation, like a plan interrupted. He laughed once and asked what this was, some kind of joke. No one answered him. The woman from the diner stepped forward, calm and centered, and said, "This is where stories end." She nodded at me, and I placed Nate's phone on the table in the center, screen lighting up as if on cue. Messages visible even without touching it. Nate's smile faded. He started talking fast, blaming misunderstandings, alcohol, people overreacting, but the room stayed silent, because silence is heavier than excuses. One by one people spoke, not shouting, not accusing, just stating what they knew, what they ignored, what they helped hide. My wife tried to interrupt, then stopped when she realized no one was protecting her anymore. Nate backed away a step, eyes darting, realizing charm had limits. And when the woman said, "This is not about ruining you, it is about ending the pattern," I understood why she brought us here. I did not yell. I did not demand apologies. I simply said I am done carrying secrets that are not mine. And something broke in the room, not loudly, but completely, because once truth is shared calmly, it cannot be buried again. Nate left without another word. My wife stayed standing, unsure who she was without the lies. And I felt the strange relief of a man who had finally stepped out of someone else's shadow. The room emptied slowly, not with arguments, but with quiet exits, chairs scraping lightly, coats pulled on without eye contact, people leaving behind the weight they had carried for too long. My wife stood near the door as if waiting for instructions, for permission, for something to hold on to. And that was when I understood how much of our life had been built on borrowed confidence. I told her we would talk later, not tonight. Tonight was for distance, not closure. She nodded, tears forming but not falling. Because even now she was choosing control over honesty. Outside the air felt cleaner, colder, honest in a way rooms never are. The woman from the diner walked beside me for a moment and said, "This is where I stop. You do the rest alone." I thanked her, not with gratitude but with recognition. She had not saved me. She had returned my sight. And then she turned and disappeared into her car like someone closing a chapter without rereading it. I drove home alone, passing streets that felt unfamiliar despite knowing them by heart. When I arrived, the house was dark, quiet, waiting. I packed a small bag, not because I was running, but because staying would turn reflection into noise. My phone buzzed once more, not from the unknown number this time, but from my wife. One sentence. "Can we fix this?" I typed back slowly. "We cannot fix what was never respected," and turned the phone off. As I lay on a motel bed staring at a ceiling stained by other people's endings, I realized the suspense was gone, replaced by something steadier, clarity. Because the real tension had never been about catching them. It had been about whether I would choose comfort over truth, and that choice was finally made. Morning came quietly, no alarm, no messages, just lights slipping through thin curtains and resting on the floor like it had nowhere else to be. I checked out of the motel without speaking much. The clerk nodded like she understood endings better than questions, and I drove without music, because silence had finally stopped feeling heavy. It felt earned. I went back to the house when I knew my wife would be gone. I needed my things, not memories, just what was mine. The rooms looked smaller in daylight, like the truth had changed their shape. I moved calmly, deliberately, leaving nothing behind that I would later need an excuse to retrieve. On the kitchen counter was a note. Not dramatic, not long. Just an apology folded neatly like it might still matter. I did not read it twice. Once was enough to know it was too late. I left the key on the table and closed the door behind me without hesitation. Outside, the world kept moving. Cars passed. People walked dogs. Life did not pause for realizations, and that was strangely comforting because it meant I did not need permission to continue. I only needed direction. Weeks passed. Not dramatically, not with sudden joy, but with steady ground. I changed routines, changed places. Some friends disappeared. Others stayed quieter but real. I heard Nate moved away, not chased out, just gone. Patterns break when no one feeds them. My wife tried once more to talk, not to argue, just to understand. And I told her understanding does not always lead to repair. Sometimes it only leads to release. One evening I returned to Harbor Street Bar, not to reclaim it, not to confront ghosts, but to test myself. I sat alone, ordered a drink, and watched the room. Nothing tightened in my chest. Nothing pulled me backward. It was just a bar again, loud and ordinary. And that was the final proof I needed. I walked out into the night knowing suspense does not end with answers. It ends when you stop waiting for lies to change. And as I moved forward, unburdened and unseen, I understood something simple and permanent. Trust once broken teaches you how to trust yourself, and that lesson stays.